Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We start shortly, and there is a simultaneous interpretation available. So for those of you who may need it, you need to take the headset here. Okay. No, David, I think we will. What I'm surprised that even Fakri is not here.
Yeah, he kind of has to be.
Session. The session is dedicated for us to discuss on how we can scale up private sector investment for adaptation in Africa. Discussing on the challenges, discussing on options for incentivizing private sector investment in adaptation in Africa. We have a wonderful panel of experts and people who have been already doing the work at their different respective level and capacity. So I look forward very much counting on you, not to spare them, but to ask them the tough questions. So we will start by inviting someone who will set the scene. Who do we call private sector in Africa regarding adaptation? And what has been done so far to reach out to them? And for that, I will invite Adit Zebo. Adit is from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and he will deliver precisely that setting the scene presentation on the landscape of private sector investment in Africa. Adit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity to present some findings of a couple of projects that SEI has undertaken with different partners throughout the years, including Perspectives, South North, and the German Development Institute, that are focused on the role of the private sector in adaptation in Africa, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So the work that we've done has focused on exploring the role the private sector can have in supporting adaptation activities, as well as the role of public sector in creating enabling environments for scaling up private sector finance. And so the reason for this work is that there is currently a finance gap in adaptation, as the current adaptation cost estimates are far above what is being delivered through climate finance, which generates pressures in bridging the gap through private sources of funding. So most adaptation research in developing countries so far has mainly been focusing on the public finance, on households, and on communities. However, private sector in Africa does play a crucial role in contributing to the country's growth and development efforts, and private sector comprises almost of 67% of the continent's investment, 75% of the economic output, and 90% of its formal and informal employment. So private sector is also widely exposed to different climate-related risks, which range from economy-wide risks to specific sectoral, industry, or company-level risks. Adverse impacts from climate change include damage to infrastructure, disruption to production processes, disruption to supply chains, as well as changes in regulation, product demand, and business reputation. So in order to get an overview of private sector participation in adaptation, we focused on climate finance projects in sub-Saharan Africa, focusing particularly on agriculture. Agriculture remains a crucial sector for growth, with between 40 to 65% of the jobs in farming, and it is likely to remain the main source of people's livelihoods for the next several years. This is also reflected and re-emphasized in African NDCs, with almost all countries mentioning agriculture as part of their adaptation commitments. So what we did was that we did a screening. We looked at over 21 different providers of climate finance in the region, and from those we scaled down into 5 global climate funds and 1 national fund, FNARVA, that funded agriculture projects and that had project documents available on their website. So in our analysis, what we did, we identified 64 projects in sub-Saharan Africa in the period of 2010 to 2016, with a total of $460 million. From these projects, we found that around 39 had some form of private sector activity. So based on this mapping, we categorized private sector participation into 3 different categories, in a typology of 3 different categories with different levels of private sector involvement, going from high to low. So in the first category, there are projects where the public sector is stimulating future private sector investments in adaptation. In our second category, there are projects where the private sector is implementing public adaptation finance projects. And in the last category, there are private sector adaptation investments that are leveraged by public sector initiatives. And if we look a little bit closer to the first category, so the major reason why private actors are not investing in adaptation is that there's very low awareness of climate risks and much less awareness of adaptation options and related business opportunities. So we found several projects focusing on engaging private actors, raising awareness, including setting up formal and knowledge exchange places, technical advisory boards, or sponsoring business roundtables, training sessions for private actors, helping with access to credits. We also found more specific projects focusing, for example, on improving hydrometeorological information, where private sector was treated as a potential funding source and paying clients, and were seeked and engaged in the design of tailored climate and weather information services. We also looked more in depth into a specific category in this aspect, the role of index-based insurance to stimulate future private sector investments. And we looked at 3 large initiatives: the African Risk Capacity, the Global Index Insurance Facility, and the Insure Resilience. And in this work, we were interested in the motivations of private actors to get involved in insurance schemes. What were the role of subsidies in these schemes, and whether these schemes were a good strategy for adaptation to climate change for smallholding farmers. So index-based insurance is justified as a climate adaptation or resilience measure because it's accepted to facilitate adaptive capacity for vulnerable population, including greater access to credit and access to new or improved technologies. But there's almost no evidence of the results of the implementation of such mechanisms in sub-Saharan Africa, and little incentives in place to conduct field impact assessments. So justification for the use of public funding support for these mechanisms has so far been mainly based on assumptions and expectations rather than evidence and effectiveness. And we found that there is little evidence that index-based insurance is actually benefiting the most vulnerable. If we go into looking a little bit more in the second category, where private sector is implementing adaptation public finance, we found also that private actors play a key role in providing inputs and services to smallholder farmers and producers to reduce their vulnerability. The private sector is also, what is notable, are not necessarily adapting their own practices, but rather supporting adaptation by the farmers. Here we found examples on provision of training to farmers on ways to add value through production processes and in marketing and commercialization. And private sector may also be expected to provide new inputs, for example, seeds and services, for example, veterinary care or irrigation. We also looked a little bit closer in this category and more in depth into specific public-private partnerships in Ethiopia, where our intention was to map what type of public-private partnerships are in place and what incentives for private actors there are to be part of these partnerships, and whether they are considering climate change. So in total, we analyzed 10 different partnerships, of which most were concentrated on export crops and on ensuring quantity and quality of supply, mainly for large corporation partners. And the incentives we identified for the participation of private actors were to usually to comply with a corporate social responsibility mandate, or to establish closer relationships with the government, and to a lesser extent to receive subsidies for entering new markets. In terms of the role of climate change, we found that most public-private partnerships referred more to clean energy solutions and more related to climate change mitigation. And particular evidence on how they were expected to deal with adaptation to climate change was less evident. More in general, we found that in many adaptation projects, public-private partnerships were suggested for agriculture projects, but there was little mention in the objectives and in the characteristics and on the partnerships or incentives for private actors to be part of these initiatives. And lastly, in the third category, we looked at how examples of where private sector investment is leveraged by public adaptation finance. Here we found limited evidence of projects using public adaptation finance to leverage private investment in agriculture projects. And in a few small-scale projects, there were private actors expected to invest in adaptation as a result of specific incentive schemes. In Zambia, for example, we found in a pilot program for climate resilience, proposing a matching grant mechanism for medium and large-scale investments focusing on adding value to agriculture produce, which is supplied by local farmers. We also found in an LDCF project on agricultural production systems in Angola, which had secured funding through a CSR initiative through the oil business over there. Here we also did a more deeper case study where we tried to look at the Green Climate Fund and how the process of getting through a proposal involving the private sector looks like. So the Green Climate Fund is committed to unleash the potential of private sector for clean energy and for climate resilience projects, and it has set up its own private sector facility to fund and mobilize private investments. So what we did, we tried to look at how a proposal goes through this stage, and we looked at one specific project in Madagascar where a private investment is expected to be leveraged at scale. So together with two public actors, Conservation International and the European Investment Bank, there was a private institutional investor. Altelia was supposed to fund up to $50 million in equity. A project involves an investment fund to support land-growing commodities and aquaculture activities in Madagascar, together with renewable energy investments, and provides a much-needed access to capital at affordable rates through this investment fund. However, despite being one of the early private sector projects...
You have exceeded my incentives.
Sorry, in 1 minute. In the Green Climate Fund, the implementation of this project has not started yet, and we also found that more broadly that the disbursement ratio was very low for private actors. And in the GCF portfolio up to 2017, we found that only 4 projects out of 14 have actually dispersed any funding. So we found that there is a process, there is a problem in actually getting through these projects. And so to summarize quickly, our analysis suggests that private sector is becoming an increasingly relevant actor in agricultural adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa, but heavily marginalized. And lessons from these experiences, we argue, could help public sector to learn how to increase private investments for adaptation, particularly by smallholder farmers and small and medium-sized businesses. And we argue that adaptation funders need to consider including private sector involvement more as part of their results, particularly in frameworks and monitoring and evaluation outcomes. And in view of interest in getting private actors involved with adaptation and a lack of transparency in private sector activity, this information could help in identifying good practices in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Adis. You have heard the 3 categories of the landscape of private sector. You have also heard that adaptation is a key component of the NDCs of all the African countries. Let me turn now to David. David, I would like to hear from you, what are the experiences of UNCDF in reaching out to private sector in adaptation? And in doing that, where do you see the farmers fit into the category of as laid by Adis?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Luke, and thank you very much to the African Development Bank for this opportunity to talk a little bit about our experience. So I think the first thing to note, of course, is that private sector and farmers and human beings in general have always adapted to climate change ever since we have been on the planet. So adaptation to climate change is not something which is new. As we've migrated and moved across the world, we have developed different types of farming systems, and anybody can see that. So it always puzzles me a little bit as to why there is suddenly this new category of adaptation to climate change, when in fact farmers in particular, but all people adapt to the climate they are in. Even this room has adapted to the snow outside. So the first thing is adaptation. If you look at it in that way, it's something that we do all the time. Now, the problem we face is that climate change is accelerating, and the pressures this acceleration is causing require us to accelerate our adaptation and to direct additional funding to try to speed up that adaptation. And that is where it becomes difficult for those who are unable to finance their own adaptation. And that is what we've been trying to do, to find a way to bridge that financing gap. Now, I think through our LOCAL program, the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility, which operates in 13 countries, it includes both public and analysis in terms of the public and the private sector of the climate vulnerability, and then what needs to be done to try to address that vulnerability. So you asked particularly about the farmers. So let me give you a very concrete example in Bhutan, in the Himalayas, where due to the warming temperature, the changing temperature, there is a whole valley. The economy is based on export of potatoes to India. Now, potatoes are no longer growing as they used to, and farmers are looking for other crops. The problem is, of course, that while the other crops they can try, they might even thrive, the value chain is not there. The contacts are not there. The export market is not there for that new produce. So where we are able to come in is to say, according to the local methodology, it is evident that potatoes are not growing anymore due to climate change, and therefore a new crop is required. So how can we try to use that, if you like, that adaptation proof, that adaptation measure of that, to address the externalities of the value chain in terms of processing, storage, marketing of the new type of crop that that valley needs to transition to. And that's the type of support that a development finance institution and should be able to come in with. And you need to have the analysis of what is the appropriate response to the vulnerability in order to get to that stage. However, the development finance institutions alone are not going to solve this problem. There is just no capacity to do what I've just described globally. There has to be another way. Unfortunately, the answer is in our hands. If you look at the role of supranational governments, supranational authorities, and to empower them as ways of also dealing with this problem, because you find they often have the information already. That example I gave, of course, it is the local government and the regional government that are the first ones to say the farmers in that valley can't export their potatoes anymore. And the local government, the regional government are responsible for the roads, sometimes the storage facilities, the warehouse facilities, and basically the facilitation required and the de-risking required in terms of public investments that can facilitate that shift. Sometimes they don't have the resources to do that, but were climate finance to see local governments as a platform to build resilience, that could also provide some additional resources to them. So we are working with local governments in that particular example to be able to facilitate that transition to the new value chain. A second example, if I may, Luke, is in the case of Tanzania, in Same district, where there's a large-scale land degradation problem. I know this is something that is close to your heart, Luke, and there we are working again with the local government and with the farmers to put together what is called a 4 returns approach, which is a multi-generational approach to land restoration. When you have an issue of land degradation, in fact, it's often monocropping, and that has led to that. If you introduce more crops, different agricultural activities, you actually have multiple streams of revenue instead of one stream of revenue, and at the same time, each ecological variety you introduce is restoring the soil for the next one. So you can actually have, as well as nature can degrade itself over 20 years, nature can also improve itself over 20 years if you invest in the right type of things. But these may be things that are not in the local culture, not in the local knowledge. So we're working very closely with Common Land Foundation to introduce new activities, new varieties. One is a fish farming enterprise, which requires irrigation, and that is part of the solution, because you bring the irrigation in and you start to regreen the valley. And so that requires a sequence of different private sector interventions, one after the other, carefully sequenced to follow the ecological restoration path. And that needs scientists to help. And there are those entities around that will help with that. And in fact, the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund has been established to invest in such enterprises. And we're hoping to put together a package from this Same district at some point to take to the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. So there's two concrete examples, but just to finish, if I may, with two summarizing points. I think the first one, for any of these things to work, there has to be some kind of proven methodology, metric system to measure the attribution effect, to measure the adaptation effect, if you like. I don't think there'll ever be one global system, but there has to be something which is trusted, either in a country, in a region, or in a place, or for a particular investment. Because if that is there, that's what can attract the concessional finance and the grant finance necessary. For example, the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund has a project preparation facility associated with it, grants associated with it, but you have to prove that you are restoring the soil according to a calculated scientific formula. That is provable. If you can meet that criteria, that is where the adaptation is, and then you get access to this additional finance. So we're working.
And that's local, right?
Yes. We're working with a variety of partners to try to develop these measurement criteria to be able to bring this additional finance. And the final thing I'd like to mention is that we at United Nations Capital Development Fund have just set up a new investment fund, which is designed specifically, it's a commercial fund, it'll look for returns, but it's designed specifically to co-finance with domestic banks, with others, in any activities that are proven to be climate resilient or building adaptation through these methodologies that are out there. So please approach me later if you'd be interested in working with us on a potential investment for that pipeline. And very much in terms of land degradation neutrality, we really want to build a portfolio of investments that deal with this issue. Thank you very much, Luke.
Thank you, David. You have alluded to the key role of local government, and our next speaker will precisely address the role of local government. He is an environmental officer from a local government in Tanzania. His name is Rogatien Lukwa. Rogatien, could you tell us what you or how you are addressing the issue of scaling up community-based adaptation in your local government?
Yes. Before I go direct to the question, let me explain a bit how we operate in Tanzania.
But you won't have much time.
I don't have much time.
No, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Let me go directly. In order to bring about adaptation to the local community, we as a government, we are dealing with we are likely to solicit a fund and channel the fund to the local government authorities, so that in those local government authorities, this sub-project being identified by the local community. So in so doing, we implemented a project called Decentralized Climate Finance. The aim of this project was to solicit the fund and channel the fund to people who in need at a local community. The purpose of this project, which was implemented in cooperation with local UNCDF, was to move fund to the local community and ask them to prioritize their sub-project which enable them to implement a project which increases resilience. And so we developed a mechanism known as performance-based climate resilience, whereby local government authorities are subjected to minimum conditions to be passed then before given fund to budget and implement some sub-project in their locality. Furthermore, not that, we also, in order to make sure that we have enough fund to continue channel the funds to local authority and the local community, we also work with other CBOs, CSOs, non-government organizations to solicit the fund and implement sub-projects in areas of local government authorities. One of the key projects we implemented, as mentioned, the DCF, Decentralized Climate Finance, has got two objectives. One is to increase capacities of this local authority in climate resilience planning, and also to build the capacity of the President Office itself to be accredited as an implementing entity. However, in doing so, there are several challenges we are facing. One of the challenges we are facing is a limited capacity of most of our local government in terms of gender inclusion and environmental management plans and something like that. On top of that, in this year also, we are currently now seeking to be accredited under the Green Climate Finance in order to increase community resilience, make sure that funds are available to finance community sub-projects.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you. We have heard the challenges that you're facing. Now, one question I have from the previous contribution, the one from David, is about de-risking. How do you de-risk someone who know nothing about his own risk? is it that part of the work you are doing at the local government level? Because you can't, if the risk can mean coming along with someone and helping him face the risk he may face in investing in adaptation. How do you do that in your local government?
Yes. One role of local government is capacity building and soil extension service about facilitating peoples in local level to identify risk first and climate change. And so doing, we are trying to train them, the local people, to identify the risk associated with changing environment.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the man who will tell us, being the director of the Green Fund of the Development Bank of South Africa, who will really tell us how the institution you lead in is really blending finance, both public and private, to scale up investment in adaptation. His name is Olympus Mantata. Olympus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think maybe I should start here. I think it has been very clear from our end that to really significantly move the needle in as far as climate activity is concerned, obviously just our financing in terms of our size would not be sufficient. Therefore, it is quite key that we use our positioning to leverage other sources of funding. And of course, private sector funding is key in this regard. So what we have done was really to say, look at a way to engage private sector, and in this case, specifically commercial banks. And we thought we are well positioned as a DFI because in a way you sit in between government as a government-owned entity and the private sector, where you find that there is a lot more comfort from the private sector in many cases to be involved in projects where they see you putting your own money in. And I just want to talk specifically about the facility that we have recently put in place with assistance from the GCF, which is the question that has been coming up quite often since one has come through to the COP. And this climate financing facility really started with our engagements with the commercial banks to understand what the bottlenecks and the barriers are in them being able to support, climate-related projects, including adaptation projects. And one of the key things that came out clearly in our consultation was, the issue around, you can talk about de-risking projects as in the form of how you structure projects. So there were two key things that came through in our engagements. The first thing was that the ability of somebody to bring in, some sort of credit enhancement resources, either in the form of first loss facilities, would be key in unlocking projects. But the main one was around the ability to support tenure extension. I'm sure you'd be aware that because of the regulations, especially around Basel III regulations coming through, challenges, around being able to fund projects that would require long tenures was quite a key thing on their regard. So we thought of putting this facility together specifically to address the barriers that were identified with the commercial banks. And, we are fortunate enough to have, our application supported by the GCF, and we are currently, just finalizing issues around contractual matters with the view that early in the year, we can start, supporting projects. What was also important was to find out in our consultation that there are actually pipeline of projects already sitting with commercial banks. And the reason why they are not being advanced are, mainly the two barriers that I've just mentioned. So we are really looking at hitting the ground running early in the year to really start supporting this type of projects. I should, of course, mention that it's not mainly just dedicated on adaptation. It's a combination of adaptation and mitigation, but we really see it as a model that would allow us to really start to have significant impact in crowding in private sector investment in the space. And, we are looking at this facility operating initially just in, rand-based countries, obviously because it is easier to manage, currency issues, easier in that setup. But the idea is that as we experience more success using this model, we can be able to replicate it in the greater region and hopefully in the continent. So we are excited about this initiative, and we are really looking at starting it operating on the ground early in the year. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yesterday in the panel, someone said that the first hurdle in Africa for people to elaborate a legible adaptation project is data. How are you addressing that challenge?
I think what we actually thought about this even in the development of the fund to say the different countries that we operate in would be at different stages in terms of availability of data. And if I can just give an example, is that we were supporting the city of Cape Town in trying to access GCF support. As many of you would have been aware of the challenges that they've had around drought. In that situation, the issue of data wasn't much of a challenge because you could easily be able to access data for the last 300 years because that was available, and it made it easier for us to be able to put together an application in support of their project. But that is not necessarily the case in all other countries where we are starting to get involved. So we are looking at ways to be able to use the capacities that exist in countries where there is better availability of data to see how that can be used to support countries that would not be in a better position. But that remains a serious challenge. But partnerships might also be a key issue in partnering with institutions that would be able to overcome the hurdle that we have identified.
Thank you. Our next speaker will address the issue of insurance. And I will call on Frederick Ochieng Uma of Transparency International Kenya, who is working on a multi-actor partnership project on climate risk insurance in partnership with German Watch. Frederick, what are the initial findings of your studies regarding the challenge and opportunities for promoting private sector investment precisely through the provision of insurance to those who are at risk? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Luke. And since I'm the youngest person in this panel, I'll try to keep within the 5 minutes. It's also important to note that today is 12th December, the day my country became a republic. So today is a very important day for us. That said, I'll take a slightly different dimension and also to tell David that being in this room is not adaptation. This is an artificial environment created for us. It's not really building your resilience to adjust to the temperatures of this particular city. So for us in Kenya, and basically in regards to climate risk insurance, I think Kenya is one of those countries in Africa that has a lot to learn from as far as climate risk insurance is. And I'll try to bring forth an intersectionality that we are currently looking at based on the models that we are using within the country in terms of how to leverage the private sector investments and bring them into this discussion of climate change. I also then believe that our understanding of climate change in this perspective is the losses and damages, the frequency and intensity of the different weather events that we're having that are forcing us to incur a lot of losses affecting livelihoods in different settings. So therefore, looking at that particular framework, it is important to create an insurance mechanism to be able to ensure that people don't lose livelihoods or lives at that particular level when we are facing some of these calamities in the country. And one of the things that the country has done is to work with the private sector and non-governmental organizations to come up with a model that can work well and assist the people to adjust effectively. One case, for example, is the climate insurance program for the country that basically took advantage of the private sector's tool called the index-based livestock insurance from ILRI, fitting into a government strategy to be able to adequately prepare and manage disasters and come up with a program that was to help pastoralists in the larger northern ASOL areas of Kenya to be able to adjust effectively and within the shortest time possible whenever there is drought or famine. And this has worked so well because then you have the government starting by paying the premiums for the farmers, and then you undergo a transition period, which basically capacity builds the farmer to understand the essence of insurance in the first place, so that when that period is over, then they are able to pick up and start paying the premiums themselves. So that kind of framework is very important because then you bring in the NGO who are then supposed to enhance good governance here. Because again, when you have this kind of engagement, it's important to also have good governance. And in good governance, you have to ensure there's accountability, transparency, and civic participation, which therefore ensures that there is social accountability. You're able to hold institutions to account as to how this money is spent. So I think looking at that particular model, it is very important to note that the private sector are very key in any climate change action, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, but significantly, in order to be able to address the losses and damages, because as time goes by, climate change becomes more serious on us. And therefore, we have to get banks and other private sector investors to be able to put their money into this kind of schemes. And it's also important to point out that the project we are currently implementing also looks at the component of human rights, because then if you're having a drought, then people are dying. That violates Constitution, the fundamental rights of human beings to be able to have a decent life in most of our jurisdictions. So it's very important to draw that intersectionality and look at it from, yes, we're having a problem of climate change that is affecting human rights, and therefore we have solutions from the private sector, the government who are in charge of development of policies and strategies, and the governance framework for the entire country. And then you have the civil society or non-governmental organizations being able to also be part and parcel of that particular arrangement to ensure there is good governance of these particular processes. And I think looking at even our agricultural insurance program, which also mimics the same strategy, I would say that we need more investors and banks to bring their money into the country and be able to kind of resource these initiatives to be scaled down to the small older farmers who are doing agriculture, because now it's majorly pastoralism. To do agriculture, people who have less than an acre piece of land, for example, to also be able to build RSA lifts. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. Well, could you tell us if the traditional insurance companies, have they shown any interest to that scheme? The traditional insurance companies in Kenya?
Yes. For example, the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program now, for this year, is being implemented by Takaful Insurance, the government of Kenya, and of course in partnership with ILRI, who designed the tool that is basically being used to implement that particular arrangement. Before that, then we had a purely private sector engagement where ILRI was working with other insurance firms like UAP to reach out to the farmer in a business model. And look, you'll agree with me that for you to have something in a sustainable manner, you have to put a business case to it. Because banks only give money to where they can get returns and people can pay their loans. And it doesn't happen in a grant arrangement. It only happens in a business arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is indeed a key person. Mrs. Ayan Adam is the director of the private sector facility of the Green Climate Fund. And my question to you, Ayan, is what is the role of the private sector facility in incentivizing private sector investment in climate change adaptation and how to scale it up, especially given that adaptation projects do deliver more than adaptation. And those benefits, how do you make sure that the private sector making investment will also capture those benefits or co-benefit?
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I think this is an area where at this point in GCF's evolution, we have not seen significant amount of traction from private sector. But that does not mean that the opportunity does not exist. So, and let's, maybe it's important for us to unpack a little bit about what adaptation means, at least in the context of GCF. Adaptations for us, it's really resilience. And how do you build resilience, not just in the agriculture side, but also in the infrastructure side? So if we see in many countries today, for example, you follow the headlines in many of the Caribbean countries that hurricane hits are actually destroying the building codes. So let's look at the whole infrastructure built environment. And it's not just the housing, but we're talking about the roads, the bridges, the ports, the ecosystem. And so if you can assume that you build something and you can lose it in X number of years completely, or you can build it with a resilience in mind, which is more expensive. And private sector, once they understand that, there is a business case attached to that. And at GCF, we want to finance that incremental cost of making a huge, so if you look at the trillions of infrastructure that is to be built, let's say in the context of Africa, it's very important that we have the resilience in place. And that could be priced, and there are many instruments that we can use that could engage the private sector to be in there. I think I agree with the previous speaker. The other area that we see significant amount of promise to engage the private sector is in the agri-space and agriculture resilience. Not just the building of the resilience, but also looking at ways to transfer risks through insurance and other means. And then finally, there are areas that are much more difficult for private sector to take on at this stage. And that will be a grant funding of specific areas. So I think once we unpack and focus on, I think the area of, to me, of infrastructure build, agriculture, as well as health related, and how trash is managed, the whole methane issues, waste to energy. A lot of these, you can have somewhat of a business framework around it. I don't think they're still commercially fully viable, and that's why GCF and others could come in and figure out how to make it attractive enough for the private sector to come in. So I think it's very important to unbundle the whole adaptation arena. It's very also important to unbundle what different countries can deal with respect to adaptation. The key business parameter here is that if we don't look at the entire resilience in a different arena, we would have a lot of issues later, and there are much more losses, much more financial, which the private sector will understand. So it's, okay, you use X amount of dollars to do this, but you have a lot more risk now because the patterns are changing. You may not be able to see it to even the investment cycle that you had envisioned. The other area within adaptation, and this is where I think I want to get back on the issue of data, is the whole water and water system changes in the rainfalls. And there is a lot of data that are missing because we have population increasing, which is a normal event. And then we have changes in global temperatures that are affecting participation levels, creating droughts in the Sahel, and so on and so forth. So, and that we still have to work on the on the mitigation side. Mitigation also is very important. So if we don't keep the global temperatures down, the cost of adaptation continues to increase. So it's not an easy puzzle, but I think for now, these discussions like this are very important for us to figure out how we can unpack the entire adaptation arena and figure out where we can attract most money. And then we focus on the areas that really require grants to do the grants. So that's my take on that.
Well, thank you, Ayan. We know that adaptation is still the poor sector in the overall climate finance. If I'm not mistaken, nowadays it's only 20% of public climate finance going to adapt. While according to the Paris Agreement, we need to at least invest 50-50. So we have a long way to go in that regard. How do you intend to help, because you are the catalyzer in the whole system of climate finance, how do you intend to catch up?
So I think
especially in, therefore, scaling up.
Absolutely. At the GCF context, we have 50-50 in mitigation and 50 in adaptation. So the way we look at it is more from a grant equivalence purposes. So if you look at it from grant point of view, we have almost 60% in adaptation, 40% in mitigation. So for us, by statute, we have to do 50% mitigation, 50% adaptation. But I think what we're talking about, how do we scale and bring private sector into adaptation? And for those, I would really focus on the areas that we can create business case around it. And to me, one is the infrastructure build. I think agriculture, health, yes or no, depending on the country. And water also is still very tricky because this is an area that a lot of countries cannot really sustain yet. So I think we should create the right regulatory framework to get a lot of money in those two areas so that you have more money to do the grants in the areas that will never produce any financing, where the countries should not be taking a loan. So to me, that's how I see the two.
Thank you, Ayan. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now it is your chance to challenge what has been said, to ask questions, and maybe bring the four initiatives that are not fitting into what has been said regarding private sector initiative, private sector investment in adaptation. So the floor is yours. Garrett?
Thank you very much. My name is Gareth Phillips. I work for the African Development Bank. Ayan, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the grants. And you said that where necessary, we should do grants and provide grants to do the things that the private sector won't otherwise do. There are plenty of adaptation activities that that might be profitable after some years. And there's a parallel here with what we did with mitigation, where developers of renewable energy were able to sell emission reduction units, which created free money for them effectively. It was as good as a grant, but it wasn't called a grant. Would the Green Climate Fund be willing to give grants to private sector project developers to lower the risks, to overcome the barriers to technology, and to help the private sector then invest in technologies that create ongoing businesses, like, for example, climate smart agriculture, where they need a kickstart to get going, first of all, but then they can take it forward. So would you give grants to the private sector for things like that?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I think on that one, I think we did something where it's almost like a grant, where we took a first loss in a small fund that's looking at resilience in agriculture in Eastern Africa, where we used our money to basically bring more private sector to come in. So it's a $50 million fund. I think 25 million is a first loss to an equity. So to me, that is like a grant. And if it's not successful, we are still protecting the private investors from in their return. So in that context, I think that is how we are approaching that. But we can also channel grants through our public sector for private activities that haven't started. So it depends on how we're sequencing it and what is the vehicle. So we can also do some basically grant investments that kind of lead the way to future private investment. And that we would have to do it with my colleague Jerry, who manages our public sector, and it will be more of a barrier removal type of a grant that precedes a private sector investment. So
Yes.
we have the flexibility to do it. It just depends on the situation.
Thank you. David, could you address the question of Garrett as well, as you have been doing something that looks similar in some of the countries, especially in Bhutan and Tanzania?
Absolutely, no. It's a very good question, and I think there's 2 or 3 different ways to look at it. I mean, we are providing grants directly to private sector developers that enables them to therefore get a loan. We as UNCDF can actually provide grants directly to private sector developers individually to a company. So we would assess a particular proposal on the basis of the incremental cost that you've talked about. The purpose of the grant is to fill that incremental cost of adding to the resilience. Now we need to, of course, our grants are scarce, and we need to be. And another company might say, "Hey, what about us? Why don't we get a grant?" So we have to show that incremental cost is there, and also that this is a business model that can be replicated by others. Otherwise, we're just favoring one company. But most importantly, how do are we actually able to measure that adaptation? And that's where the insurance industry and others can come in, because you can look at the insurance industry as well as a way of measuring adaptation. Because if insurance premiums would go down, if something happened, then by definition, you've adapted, because the premium is going down. So you can work with them in lots of different ways, insurance companies, as transferring risk, but also as a measure of adaptation, using their premiums as a measure of that. So yes, we also, in terms of first loss, I'd be really interested to talk to you offline, because we have established an international municipal investment fund which will invest directly in local government, public-private partnerships and private investors that are looking to build resilience. And that would be looking for some kind of first loss support from the GCF, where we would be able to show that this is a pipeline of investments that are oriented towards SDG 13. They meet the Paris Agreement in certain measure indicators. Only those investments will be funded. But it will be interesting to work with you perhaps on a first loss for that. So I think there's 2 ways it can be done. A grant directly to a project, high overhead costs. You have to have a lot of paperwork to show why this project, not that one. And that's the problem. And secondly, a first loss for an investment fund is very helpful. But again, you need to be able to show, because investors in the investment fund, if you put your first loss in our funds, you are buying climate resilience. And we will need to show you that that's what you're getting. So I think, again, it comes back to this issue of indicators and measurement. And just finally, Luke, I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the platform, but I've just come from another meeting where KfW presented an extremely interesting satellite approach to use satellite data to measure both soil degradation over time, reforestation over time, and they are using that to measure the impact of their climate resilient projects. So these are the kind of things we need: satellite data, insurance premiums, to be able to show why this project is being financed, not the other one. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Madam?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Alice Kaudia. I will make just a comment that the highest risk to small-scale farmers in Africa is this unpredictable rainfall. And therefore, in terms of solution, we would need to invest in on-farm rainwater harvesting to support soil drip irrigation, so that farmers are able to have their crops growing throughout the year. Even if they do that, though, if we have to go through insurance, we may need to underwrite the risk of farmers not being fully informed about the insurance product. And the insurance services should be closely linked to meteorological services. We have had situations whereby farmers take up, they pay their premiums. At the end of it, the data reading says that in your area, there was adequate rainfall. Yet there was inadequate rainfall. So the farmers, particularly small-scale farmers in Africa, need a lot of support. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, Madam, I will take 3 questions and then we come back to the panel. Yes, please go ahead. And then, Eamon.
Okay, thank you. I'm Julia Riggi from the Red Cross, here with another colleague from the Red Cross over there. I have a question of a slightly different angle on this, which is investing in adaptation support for urban SMEs. Specifically, many countries are rapidly urbanizing. SMEs contribute quite a large amount to the GDP of many countries in Africa. And then from a Red Cross perspective, we're interested because if SMEs can thrive through disasters, the wider community will as well, or the wider community will recover faster as well. So how do you see opportunities for scaling support for SMEs to adapt and grow with the changing climate as well?
Thank you. And then, sir?
Thank you very much. Ayman Shakari from Morocco. A couple of short comments. The first of them was bouncing on this idea of measuring adaptation, sharing the fact that Morocco has been working for quite some time now on metrics for adaptation, and we'd be happy to share that expertise in South-South cooperation, of course, in Africa. The second element was the fact that I was a bit surprised, I have to say, by what I felt was a lack of focus or mention of the regulatory framework and legal environment when it comes to this particular aspect, which I feel were quite important to mention. As impressed as I was by this session as a whole, that surprised me a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Now back to you, panel. Regarding the possibility of supporting farmers and also addressing the risk of information, of lack of it, maybe that question is to the local government person on board, Mr. Lukua. And how are you addressing that risk? If the farmers are not well informed while they are taking, an insurance and paying a premium, this may backfire to them, right?
Yes. In addressing this risk of the farmers, we in local government, we normally work in close concert with the meteorological agents and to make sure that appropriate information reaches the farmers accordingly. But also, we have some of our extension staffs which work closely with farmers in day-to-day basis, telling us what is happening on ground, what precaution takes, what sorts of crops to plant, and all those kinds.
Thank you. And Alex? Oh, Frederick, sorry. Ferry.
Yeah, look, if you want somebody to know that chapati is sweet, if you come to Kenya, you first buy that person 4 consecutive meals and so that you prove the taste. And then that person can pick up whether they want to continue eating chapati on their own cost or not. And I think the approach that our government, for example, took by starting to pay the premiums for the farmers and considering that this covers the 75% ASOL area of Kenya, and then they're able to, which kind of experiences drought and famine almost every year or once every 2 years. The farmers are able to do their basic math on how much they have saved with that particular scheme. And then after, when the government withdraws from that particular arrangement, then they get the motivation to keep up paying for that particular policy. So that works in terms of first building your capacity to understand that, yes, what you are experiencing didn't happen before you used to have droughts once every 5 or 10 years. Now it's coming after every 2 years. Your only source of livelihood is your livestock, which you risk losing entirely without any compensation. If you pay this amount over this particular period, it is obvious after 2 years you'll have drought, but then you'll have a way of getting something out of what you've lost in that particular process. So I think that kind of arrangement works in doing 2 things at the same time, but I also agree that we need to have local government and government arrangement of extension services and bringing capacity to the local level. Thank you.
Yes, the next question, I think it is for you, Olympus, regarding how to support SMEs, especially urban SMEs, but I would say just SMEs, because the farmers could also be considered as SMEs, but she said urban SMEs, and opportunity to support them regarding adaptation, investment, and opportunities too. How are you doing that through your facility?
Thank you very much. I think one of the key challenges we have found in supporting SMEs would be pretty much the ticket size of the kind of projects that would be brought before us. As you would understand, normally the ratio of your transaction cost versus what you are trying to support can be a challenge. But the way that we've been trying to deal with that is more clustering, the SMEs based on the type of projects that they are dealing with. And in that way, a programmatic approach allows us to be able to, to provide support. And one of the things that we found useful on our side is because as a bank, we have, a project preparation facility. So most of the time, you would find that one of the challenges is really transitioning the projects from, concept to bankability. So because of that facility, we have been able to, to support most of those projects at the early stage towards bankability, and where it makes sense to cluster them or to look at them in a programmatic nature, we have been able to do that. But also being able to start with them at an earlier stage help us to really position the projects such that by the time they get to a point where they need to be implemented, we understand the project better, we can manage the risk better, therefore find it a lot easier to be able to support them. So that is in the main how we have been able to, to deal with that. Maybe one other thing to mention, the consultation that I mentioned earlier in terms of talking to, the commercial banks around this climate financing facility that I mentioned earlier. We found that in their pipelines, there is a lot of projects coming out of SMEs. And, so this gives us an opportunity to even ramp up the support that we have been providing within this facility. Thank you.
This is a quite surprising information that you have just given me, saying that in their pipeline, there are a lot of projects coming from SMEs. Because my question to you, Ian, was that in Africa, for instance, when we say private sector, actually it's up to 80% of it that is made of SMEs. How is the GCF, therefore, preparing to reach out to those, a larger share of private sector, let's say in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, to be more specific?
Definitely fully agree. A huge part of many African economies is 90-80% of SMEs, and resilience for SME is a key factor. So our approach is to go through the financial institutions that are working with the SMEs, whether they are cooperative, whether they are an MFI, whether they are a bank, is to work through them. And then we also just did a new strategy where SME is at the center of it. And we will still have to go through what links the SME to the GCF, and then bring those in a kind of a programmatic approach. But one of the key points that most SMEs have noted is that without energy, there is nothing that we can do. And so, for example, we just signed a very large facility on Rooftop Solar. A lot of SMEs actually don't even need to be connected to the grid. So we are looking at solutions in distributed rooftop solar, energy efficiency, because many of them spend huge amount of their funds in paying for power. So if you have a barber shop in Senegal, in Dakar, and there is no electricity, he can't make any money because he's got to shave people and so on and so. So I think it's at the core of that, to us, the SME story is the energy transition. And let's not lose sight of that, because we need to give access to energy at a very low cost way to first everyone. That makes SMEs first resilient. So we have done a number of lines to some of the banks. AFDB is supposed to give me one, I'm still waiting, with women. But this is an area that we are going to look closely through. We have seen some coming on adaptation, because SMEs in the rural side is really trade, small shops, businesses. In the rural side is where you're dealing with the whole agriculture arena. So I think they're equally important to the African economy, and we have to look at them, both of them, in a very cohesive fashion. Thanks.
Thank you. Add this on that, and then I will go back to the floor and take
Okay.
3 other questions. Yeah.
Thanks. Just some comments on the question. So in terms of the index-based insurance and rainwater harvesting, so in our work, what we found was that most of the impact evaluation were happening at the meso level. So how many insurers were selling, and what kind of income there were, but very few, found almost no evaluations on the impact on the ground. So what effect was there? What role had the basis risk? And I think there is the big issue around why index-based insurance is not really that effective as it could be. In terms of urban SMEs, I did some work in Rwanda, where the Rwandan government collaborates with the National Private Sector Facility, so the business association, in trying to raise awareness, because SMEs make almost 90% of the private sector. However, they noted that funding was a big issue, so there was just not enough funding, but they liked the model. In terms of regulation, I think also, again, work I did in Rwanda and Kenya, I think most countries have really good, well-designed policy documents, particularly on climate and climate change adaptation. But when you go one step further and looking at many of these are not really followed up. So there is something in place, but there are no regulations, and there is no penalties for not following them. And one thing we saw also was, for example, environmental impact assessments are usually required for almost all projects, but they almost never include aspects of the role of climate impacts, what they will have on the project's life cycle.
Thank you. Then 3 more questions. Yes, sir, and then madam, and here. Okay.
Okay, my name is Nicholas. I come from Kenya. I work with Christian Aid. We have piloted devolved climate financing with support from public funds. And you've talked about the approach of the public funds kind of attracting private investment to support adaptation. Actually, the challenge we are facing is, and this is what the policymakers ask us, how do we use public finance to support private investment? But we are able to prove to them that there are private investment which have got adaptation benefits even to the public. But they ask us that critical question: how do we use public funds in private investment? That's a critical thing that maybe you can share with us. What is your experience from elsewhere? 2, looking at, say, working with the microfinance institution and the commercial banks so that they can engage with rural communities, farmer associations or cooperatives. They are also fearing the aspect of the high risk. Again, how do we de-risk, this kind of investment so that the MFIs and the commercial banks can truly work with the small-scale farmers? Thank you.
Thank you. Then, madam.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Marie-Josée Ouenou. I'm from Ivory Coast. Allow me to change the subject of your presentation. My question is, how can we encourage more companies from the private sector to invest more in green projects? Because Mr. Olympus Mantata said that there is a lot of projects for SMEs, more projects, but what I saw in my country, in the region, is that there is not enough companies who develop green business, green businesses, we can respond to the adaptation challenges. So how can we encourage which type of mechanism and guarantees we can create to help them create more green business?
Thank you. And then you, sir, and then you lastly.
Thank you very much, President. I see that more of the panelists speak English, but I want to do speak in French. I'm sorry. Ce que je voulais dire, c'est que entre la problématique du secteur privé qui veut aller très vite en recherchant le profit et la question fondamentale de l'adaptation qui nous demande parfois du temps pour adresser des questions sur des durées plus longues, je pense qu'il y a à se poser deux choses. C'est que pour le secteur privé, la question fondamentale est liée surtout au risque. Moi, je suis de la Banque agricole du Sénégal, donc nous suivons un processus d'accréditation au Fonds vert. Et je suis tout heureux d'entendre, madame, que je pense que notre accréditation va aller très vite parce que nous, on a un système de management environnemental très bien fait qu'on vous a déposé. Et ce que nous demandons, ce qu'on nous pose souvent, c'est que les secteurs privés vous disent on a du mal à accéder au financement du fait des taux de crédit très élevés et on a du mal à avoir de la visibilité liée au risque. Moi, je pense qu'au niveau, en tout cas, des zones semi-arides, si nous arrivons à régler ces deux questions fondamentales, nous pourrons adresser réellement. D'autant plus que pour la plupart, nos CDN, en tout cas, si nous voulons adresser des questions fondamentales et des réponses vraiment pratiques par rapport à nos CDN, la question de l'adaptation est une question centrale. Alors, l'autre question que je voulais poser, Président, si vous me le permettez, un des panélistes a parlé de mode d'évaluation des risques. Alors, j'aimerais savoir par quel outil, comment vous utilisez, comment évaluez-vous ce système de risque et en quoi la prise en charge donc, de l'évaluation de ces risques offre une plus-value pour les questions d'adaptation. Je vous remercie.
Merci bien. And you, sir?
Merci, je m'appelle Pape Biram Touré, je suis parlementaire sénégalais. Et je vous remercie de m'avoir donné l'occasion et l'opportunité de discuter de ça. Je pense que la question de l'adaptation est une question un peu très centrale et dont les collectivités locales, comme l'a si évoqué, peuvent jouer un rôle très important. Mais il se pose aussi la question aussi de ces réformes foncières, parce qu'il y a la question foncière qui est très préoccupante. Et à ce niveau, est-ce que cela ne constitue pas quand même quelques difficultés? L'autre aspect, c'est que y a-t-il des mécanismes d'accompagnement à ces collectivités pour pouvoir accéder au financement? Puisque les procédures étant longues, difficiles et techniques, il faut quand même un système d'accompagnement pour pouvoir accéder à ces crédits pour les collectivités territoriales, de ce point de vue. L'autre aspect, c'est on parle du financement via la banque de développement par l'intermédiaire de certaines banques. Nous avons connu quand même des banques dans nos pays qui sont beaucoup plus commerciales que développement. Est-ce que cette dimension est prise en compte par rapport au taux, par rapport au risque, mais aussi par rapport à la rapidité de la mise en place de ces crédits pour les développements? Je vous remercie.
Merci bien, Monsieur le député. So now let me come back to the panel. We have had some very interesting questions. One is precisely about a framework to capture adaptation benefit. Don't we need a mechanism, a system that really help to account for the co-benefit that is generated by adaptation project when it is undertaken by private sector? Who would like to address that one? David?
Maybe I could give a stab at that. We do need this, and it's not going to be easy to have a standard measure. One thing that we are trying to do, and maybe in this way to answer a couple of the other questions on risk evaluation, etc., is by having a kind of process measure whereby firstly, one needs to measure the vulnerability. Has that vulnerability assessment been measured? Secondly, what would be the responses to that vulnerability? And thirdly, how does the investment chosen fit into one of those responses? So the question about SMEs in an urban area, what's the vulnerability in that urban area? What would be the appropriate responses? And then, does this particular company meet any one of those appropriate responses? If it doesn't, then it's not doing resilience. If it does, then it is. And then fourthly, once the investment has taken place, of course, what has been the impact? And that can be then knowledge for the future. So if that process is followed rigorously by different entities over a period of time, you can build up a methodology for beginning, a kind of approach to begin to look at how you can at least sort the wheat from the chaff in terms of what is additionality, what is not, in terms of responding to vulnerabilities and responses. Because there is lots of different responses to a climate vulnerability, and they're all valid. But there has to be one of those responses. And then the third measurement, of course, is how effective is this response? Because maybe it's a valid response, but that's not a very effective way of doing that response. I mean, the classic way we try to measure this is, let's imagine flooding or a lot of climate adaptation is about water management. Let's imagine there's an area that is likely to flood more frequently. So there's two responses. You either run away and do everything somewhere else, or you improve the water management by some defense or some irrigation or something. They're both valid responses, and there may be private sector approaches to both. But as long as you've gone through that process, and then you look at how effective is that response, that's the beginning of a measurement. And finally, just on one person asked how we would evaluate the risk. So we have what we call a dual key system in our investment committee, which is that there's a credit officer who does a more kind of standard risk evaluation, and that is accompanied by an impact evaluation. And you need both keys to unlock the transaction. And at any point during the transaction structuring process, we also have a project preparation facility. You have the impact measurement team and the credit measurement team working together. So if in order to make it less risky, you have to do too much, it no longer has an impact, the impact team can walk away and say, sorry, this might make a profit, but this now doesn't have any impact. Or if you go too far in the impact direction, the credit team can say, well, this would have great impact, but it's never going to repay a loan. So you have this creative tension between the credit and the impact, and you need the approval of both teams at the investment committee to take the investment to the next stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. Mr. Lukua, I heard you speaking about performance-based resilient grant being used through the local government budget to actually build infrastructure. While you're doing that, do you invite private sector to understand the type of infrastructure you are building and how this may help de-risk what they may be facing regarding climate risk?
Yes. In the first place, I have to underscore that we in local government, adaptation for the people, what actually we are doing in this in the performance climate-based resilient grant, we are trying to motivate our local governments to include climate changes issues in their planning, their strategic plan. This is like a carrot and a sticks. If they do well, then they are given more to first, and increasing the capability of the community to adapt. And this sub-project normally implemented in a public goals. It's not individual one in the locality. You say a project increasing community resilience to climate in a certain locality. That's that. In terms of how channeling funds to local authority, I do agree that we have limited capacity to make sure that funds are channeled to the people need. And that is why we at the PORAC, the President Office, Regional Administration, and local governments, is trying to be registered as implementing entity so that to harness the fund to GCF and make this channel, this fund to the local governments to implement their planned sub-project for community resilience. And
yeah. But now I still have two questions that are not yet answered. One is regarding using microfinance institutions precisely to reach out to communities and including SMEs. Maybe Olympus, have you considered working with microfinance institutions?
As I've mentioned earlier, we have had support for SMEs, not microfinance institutions at all. But I should mention that the bank has for the last 6 years been managing our National Green Fund on behalf of our Department of Environmental Affairs. And through that fund, we have had an opportunity of supporting organizations that are very much of a microfinance nature. Actually, there was a fund that we put in place that is no longer active, but for the past 5 years was quite active in the space. But as the bank itself, as the DBSA itself, we are not active in that in the microfinance space.
Now, let me give you a chance of, in 1 minute, maybe making some concluding remarks. I will start from with you, Edis.
Okay, thanks. I also tried to connect to the question around public finance, and we are still in the position where we need to spend public finance in order to leverage private finance for adaptation. But it's also important to distinguish between private finance for adaptation contributing to adaptation as a public good, or private finance for adaptation that just climate proofs its own operations. And to tell about an anecdote from a project in Rwanda where I was interviewing people in Funava. So there was this project around rainwater harvesting, and it involved a bank, a local producer, and small-scale farmers who were able to get low-cost loans to install these things on the roof. And this bank was involved providing low-cost loans with support from public funding. However, the bank, despite making a profit on this project, saw it more as a corporate social responsibility, because the alternative cost on doing this, which was more had more longer lead times, it was more work intensive than working on a traditional project that bank would have generated higher profits. So we are still in a position where we need to see this as an investment for long term to actually create a business case for adaptation. We're not there yet.
Thank you, Adis. David?
Just two concluding remarks on the public money. I think, if it's global public funds, they can go into first loss facilities and that kind of thing that drive investment in the right direction for these dedicated climate funds, adaptation funds. If it's local government public funds, like the locale mechanism that we're talking about, that should go for complementary infrastructure, roads, access roads that de-risk the private investment, not directly to the company, because that would not be appropriate. Secondly, when it comes to private finance, I think the tenor of the loans, the type of loans, it's not only the availability of finance, it's the type of finance, as the colleague from DBSA has pointed out. And the private sector, domestic banks, I think need to look again at some of their own domestic economies and recalibrate their asset allocation ratios and some of their lending policies. It's not so much about the interest rate, it's about the type of package that is available. And the tenor of the loan is a key part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Then Rogatien, please.
Yes. Local people normally know their problem and they know about how to adapt. What they need is fund some climate resilience project to be implemented in local people, in local areas, in localities. So here, what they need actually is fund to implement, to finance climate resilience project to increase their resilience. They know the option.
Thank you. Then, yes, you, sir.
I think national development banks play a very crucial role in crowding in private investment. On the one hand, most of them being government-owned, have an opportunity to influence policy and regulatory framework in as far as they prepare an enabling environment for investment. On the other hand, the relationship with the financial institution create an opportunity whereby you can, on a blended finance approach, be able to bring in private investment to really scale up investment in climate activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Olympus. Frederick?
Yeah, first, thank you for the opportunity and for the good moderation. Two is also to point out that there is need for continuous capacity, especially bringing stakeholders on the table and discussing some of these issues. Because I'm not one person who believes there is no business case in adaptation. Everything has a business case. Whether you're going to irrigate, you can come up with solar panels to power that irrigation. Whichever adaptation action you come up with, there is always a business case. We just need to sit down with the private sector. We just need to sit down with non-government organizations and our governments to have this discussion, because money is with the private sector. As long as they can invest in it and get their money back, they will be funding most of our adaptation and mitigation projects. And also just to point out, in light of that particular line, German Watch and TI are working on another case of the human rights component and equity bit of this adaptation and mitigation. And now we are working on a paper which we'll share in the course of the year and possible in the next COP to be able to start this discussion, because we have to protect livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. And now to you, Eamon.
Okay. First, let me take the MP's question. How do you get the districts or MPs that represent? I think we have country systems. I think Madeleine is our NDA. So the country strategy for Senegal should look at all the different regions and what are the key climate challenges. And that is what we try to finance, both through public and private. So I can take it offline, but this is something that the country should really look at every region, every place, to see what are the vulnerability and what can be financed. So that's something that we're doing quite a lot on the countryside. With respect to adaptation, I think still, first, I'm very encouraged by the continued support and continued discussions to enlighten how we look at adaptation. I think we are at the very early stages. There will be things that we're going to put business case around it. And there will be few areas where there is no way they will be generating revenue and they're public good. And that should be where the focus of the grant, or both from the internal country but also from outside, should focus on. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in the adaptation area in the Africa context. And so hopefully we are at the beginning of learning, and I think GCF is a learning institution. It was designed that way. So it doesn't mean that what we have today will be the only offering. So I think as we learn and as we see that there are different approaches, we will take that into account and hopefully come up with a different menu of options that are supporting countries that are vulnerable to adapt and to become more resilient. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I would like to leave you with some few key words like business cases, project pipeline, public good, adaptation core benefit, regulatory framework, and mechanism, community of practice. We need to pull all these together and reflect on how we take it from here when we know that in Africa, more than 80% of the private sector is made of SMEs. So please join me to congratulate our panel. Wonderful. Well done. Thank you. And let us also thank our host at African Development Bank. Thank you.